Man, last night, Elliot, I tried to get you to go on Dom's live stream because he was cooking chicken for the first time. And I was like, oh, you know who could help him cook some chicken? I know a certain black man in Georgia that knows how to cook a chicken.
Oh, I can cook a chicken. I can cook a whole chicken. I can cook many whole chickens at once if I needed to.
Yeah. Anyways, welcome back, everyone. And we're going to continue our march through history.
Are we talking about fascists again? Because last week gave me an idea for like a comedy sketch about fascist, fashionistas, but like for houses. And they were yelling at me about replacing the fascia on my house facade.
What do you...
Because, fascists love a good uniform and they love telling you what to do. Sorry, I didn't warm up. I was just before we started recording. So I was just trying to get my alliteration exercises in.
There you go.
I mean, what's a little fashion? What's
Fascism,
a little...
yes.
Yeah.
See, it's harder than
what's
it looks,
a little
right?
fascism between friends. Yeah, it is.
It's a beautiful thing, really.
And we will quote you saying that.
Yes.
That's the bumper sticker.
Welcome back.
Already?
This is the Poor Proles Almanac. We usually are not this heavily talking about fascism, but that's the day it is.
Sometimes.
Today we're talking about the organic movement. And yeah, there were a lot of fascists back then because we talked about biodynamics and there were a lot of fascists and there's a lot in the organic movement. I guess the real question is, should we care that fascists were into it?
We should be clear that with the biodynamics movement, it was literal Nazis and not like an HOA.
Yeah, not an HOA. Like my example in the beginning of this, they were actual Nazis.
Actual Nazis.
When you had mentioned all of this before, and when I was reading the episode notes, I didn't understand the connection to any of it because I didn't read any of this. I'm going to be honest. So it was really fascinating.
Fascinating.
Yeah. See, you're doing it. You're doing your thing now. That's why this is our
warming
podcast.
up.
Yeah.
Letting them cook.
Yep. We don't have to warm up for episodes anymore. We can just jump right into it. So yeah, tell us about this, because I didn't know how these were connected when you said organics and biodynamics had like fascist roots. So that's what this episode's about. So let's jump in.
Yeah. So we got to go back. Organics, as the term exists, really began in India, but not through an Indian, but through a British botanist, a guy named Sir Albert Howard. In 1903, he had gone to India as a professor, and his whole thing was he was going to go teach them how to grow food in India. Turns out he got there and was like, actually, they are better than us at this. And he started writing down their techniques and, wrote a book about it.
Okay, so this has to be the tail end of the era of being able to like read a handful of books and call yourself an expert on things, because I feel like a lot of our episodes have people doing that. Like, it sounds kind of like a guy that says like he did his own research and then flew halfway around the world to teach people what he learned in a book, and it didn't apply, obviously. So I guess too bad he doesn't have two initials, so his name's not important. So I guess his name will be lost to time. We could just move on.
Tale as old as time. No initials, not interested.
Not interested.
Doesn't matter. Before even reaching the United States, the organic movement had a pretty big division. And that was between those who wanted to see or prove that organics was better for humans and the landscape, and those who believed that organic was basically like a spirituality that brought people closer to God. And that was kind of more of that biodynamics strain, right? A researcher named Philip Conford tried to describe the early European organic advocates, and he described them stating that their opposition to industrial agriculture was rooted in a belief in a natural order whose limits could not be exceeded with impunity. The organic criticism of orthodoxy was essentially prophetic. It predicted problems and ultimate disaster for any agricultural system which flew in the face of the natural order. It read the signs of the times and called for a return to God's ways.
Okay, so this only sounds like good things.
Right? Now, despite the birth of the movement coming from Howard watching indigenous farmers of India, the organic movement developed a social position of nativism in which native soil health reflected the strength of a race. Organics challenged an international commerce system that took power away from communities and was a means to return to an agrarian social foundation, and quickly became the basis for fascist-leaning, like, blood and soil type groups.
Okay, so they mixed farming with like a revival, basically. So it sort of became, a breeding ground for far-right Christians, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, any Luddite-leaning Christian or Uncle Ted type person could find like their space in this area. And for the Christians, they found similar benefits to the organics movement in that they were typically skeptical of industrialization and the increasing power of like urban-based financial institutions that usually gain its power at the expense of the more religious countryside. From either of these perspectives, the undercurrent was the same, that the autonomy of rural communities was necessary for a natural order to remain. And that was a natural order based on God, or a natural order based on race, or both.
So basically, it's like the rights playbook here in the U.S. That sounds pretty similar.
Hmm. Despite the fact that like many on the right treat organic as like some secret liberal plot.
Yeah, there's a lot of division on the right about organics, and we are going to talk about that a little bit later. But to get back to pre-World War II, in Great Britain, this guy named Jorian Jenks, which just sounds like a fake name,
Love it.
he was considered one of the primary figures in the organics movement. While Jenks was also basically the biggest writer in the organics journals in the country, he was also an active member of the British Union of Fascists.
Don't love it as much.
Yeah. He also wrote for the Fascist Quarterly and advocated that agriculture, not money, should be the basis of our economy and wealth measurement.
I mean, that kind of works for the U.S. We talked about the corn economy.
You mean the economy?
Jesus, Andy, you've been doing so well.
Yeah.
I thought we had gotten you off that stuff.
I thought he's been getting worse. I'm not a doctor, but he's definitely getting worse.
I get that a lot.
Mhm.
Many other leaders of the organics movement in England basically moved in lockstep with Jenks. A couple names that you won't know: Oswald Mosley, Henry Williamson, basically the most British names you could come out with. Our good friend Viscount Lymington from the biodynamics episode, the Duke of Galtshire. Matt, give me a good Duke of Galtshire like pronunciation.
The Duke of Galtshire.
There we go. Look at that. So good.
It's not even a name, it's a title.
I know, but it's too British for me, right?
He's Duke Galtshire.
That sounds better.
Mhm.
There you go. Basically, all these people were advocates for like definancializing the economy, tying organic husbandry into like racial purity, anti-Semitism, and the fact that a lot of these people clearly came from like old money. They're basically fighting against capital to keep the old feudalist type system in place, reinforced by racism. And like all this was predicated on like being able to restore rural spaces, right? And making those rural spaces self-sufficient the same way like a lord's manor was self-sufficient, right? Like that's what they basically wanted to go to.
Fiefs?
A fiefdom.
Fiefs? Fiefdom, yes.
Fiefs?
There we go.
Was that the word?
Yeah, that might be the right word I'm looking for.
If not, I think it's close enough.
Yeah. People writing about this and like making these cases that like the problem with why Britain was becoming weak was because their food quality wasn't good, that they didn't have whole British bread. And that was like the reason why the decline of the British people, that they were weaker than they used to be, and that they needed organic foods for, and this certain guy, PC Loftus's words, for quote unquote racial reinvigoration.
I mean, I hate to break it to them, but Brits were never running the board. So basically what you're saying is that like early 20th century blamed like weak bread for their period's incels.
I mean, I couldn't imagine taking over 75% of the known world for spices and thinking that your food is weak because you don't know how to use them. But just think about this in terms of today. The pure Chad organic bread eater versus the diluted virgin processed bread eater. I mean, is that truly the Commonwealth of bread?
There's so many ways I could have crushed early 20th century memes. So many ways.
You would have had a pamphlet for sure.
Daily,
Mhm.
daily pamphlets. They know me. All the wenches know me for my pamphlets.
I also think you would have died in prison or on a pyre.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
probably. But to that point, even folks who didn't align openly with fascism found themselves still contributing to like far-right journals around organics, like the New Pioneer. And even like Sir Arthur Howard, who had learned about organics from indigenous Indian people, would go and then like write articles for fascist organics magazines. Like it's hard to not see how the organics movement at this time was just basically an extension of fascism. And it was just like, how do we relate to the earth around us?
It was basically like applying fascism to farming.
Yeah, and like what underscored a lot of this was just a resistance to industrialism. And the problem was that many socialists found themselves like identifying the same issues of society failing as the fascists that they despised. That was primarily like financial systems and the increasing reliance on mechanization, the loss of autonomy, all these same issues that like underscore just like human needs. And in response, the socialist response at this time was really to go and find ways to restore new unions, like union guilds and things like that, to push against industrialization, to fight back from like the power of the financial industry that was driving industrialization. And the public labor movement at the time really didn't want to engage with this issue of like financing capital and speculation and scaling and all these things. So a lot of people that had these very like core beliefs of what was wrong with the system didn't feel like they had a party to belong to. And many people on the left ended up finding themselves on the right just because they felt like they had a place.
Oh man, that doesn't sound like politics today one bit.
Yeah, you know, what's old is new again, right?
That pendulum swings, baby.
Hmm.
So in response to this like reality, a group was created called the Economic Reform Club and Institute. And basically what it would do is try to coalesce a lot of voices away from outright fascism. The purpose of the group is very simple. They wanted to better understand how the monetary system worked. And that's like very like think tanky bullshit, right? But what's interesting is by 1939, most of the major right-wing figures in the organic movement, like Viscount Lymington, as well as many other noted socialists, found themselves like on the same side of something. They were in the same group that wasn't political, and they're arguing for things like food policy based on human needs instead of financial gains, driving attention to health and food quality, making sure healthy food was at affordable prices for every citizen. And even our good friend Jorian Jenks was one of the editors for their bulletins.
So these far right folks wanted affordable food and less power in the hands of financial systems and class. And this is during World War II, but we aren't in Nazi Germany. This is Britain, right? So talk about blurred lines. Like, which side we talking about here?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure that the reforms around basically like food getting cut off to the whole island of Britain and like imports plummeting did that play a role in all this? And like the war production board?
Yeah, I would imagine it did. I know, historically speaking, the populist movement in England at this time was very divided about support for fascism. I mean, you know, the running thing is like England could have very well have gone alongside the Nazis because there was enough margin of error that they could have gone either direction, right? And like I think this points to that reality, right? That people were very concerned about their basic needs being met, and they felt like a very specific group of people were taking them away. And to them, you know, the trope of like Jewish people having access to capital and things like that plays into that narrative very easily. And that's how you can see these things kind of coalesce into this one narrative. Even when a lot of people will say, like the socialist side would say, like, I don't agree with these parts of it, but you've got all the other stuff. So, oh well. Not that that's okay or right or anything, but I think it does help explain like how you can see these things kind of blend together. But the point of this organization, the Economic Reform Club and Institute, was to try to refocus that energy away from the racist part of it and to focus on the populist part of it. In that way, I think it was able to keep it from becoming more than what it could have been.
Right. My last 2 cents before we take a break will be, it sounds like they're taking the same ideals and principles and just doing like lateral thinking with it. So it applies to farming, and now it applies to food. Now it applies to politics. Now it applies to who I'm going to date. Like it just, you know what I mean? Like they just kept leapfrogging the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
It seems too simple. Simple. That's all I'm going to say. Simple thinking.
I mean, you would say that about Trump before he became president, that he was too simple, and here we are.
No, we like complex systems. I need complexity.
Oh, yes.
I like to be confused and scared, you know?
Oh, yeah.
I don't like simple things.
Well, then I guess it's time for our commercial for Furin Reed's Fashionistas. So don't buy any of their products because fuck them.
Are you finding that there's too much fash in fast fashion? This is Carla with Lennon's Linens. We apply the immortal linenist science to keep clothes lasting for decades. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out our pop-up shop in the Red Square in Moscow, Russia, and see how long our work holds up with our hand-picked Short King model, the one and only 100-year-old Vladimir Lenin. Wow, look at that drip. So stop Stalin and get your Lennon's Linens today. Exclusions apply. See Vladimir Putin for details.
Okay, so after World War II, our good friend Jenks continued to write and influence the organic movement. He traveled to the United States and spoke at the United States Conference on Food and Soil. While open fascism wasn't acceptable, as it once had been even in the United States, the same names continued to be printed and headlining in all the magazines. Many of the writers traded in nationalism and purity for Christianity and the divine. And this was what would be called Christian sociology.
Cue the far-right Christo-fascism. Do-do-do-do.
Okay, so because I'm learning along with the audience, I feel like I can already see where this is headed.
That would be correct. This continued into the 60s and 70s and paired the purity of the spirit with the purity of the soul. Basically, our relationship to the landscape and our food source as this Jeffersonian ideal, right? The homesteader, agrarian lifestyle. And that's something we even saw happening with the Nashville agrarians, if you guys remember, a while back.
Mm-hmm.
But they do come up again in the 80s. In 2 episodes, we're going to talk about them a little bit again. Yeah, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the Korean War and the rise of the new rural white supremacy and how that paired into homesteading.
Yeah, the new rural white supremacy, because it hasn't been done so many times over that it has to keep being reinvented. It sounds riveting. I'm excited about that.
I know, you love a good white supremacy.
You know, I've always said that about Elliot, that he loves a good white supremacy story.
Yeah, I read the littered Chick-fil-A cup one time before throwing it in the trash, and I get branded.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I just read the back of a cup, guys.
That's it. Now, the split between the American organic and biodynamic movement, which we just covered the biodynamic movement last week, so if you're interested or don't know anything about it, go check that out, as well as the split between those movements and the permanent agriculture movement began in 1943. As far as historians are concerned, it really began in 1943 with the publishing of Edward Faulkner's book, Plowman's Folly, and this book outlined this concept called trash farming. Now, the first criticism of this book actually came from the USDA Soil Conservation Services, led by Hugh Bennett, who we talked about in our permanent agriculture episodes. He was the director of the program at the time. Many of the other critics would criticize Faulkner for using very small sample sizes and that we can't make policy change based on small sample sizes. But because the book caught fire and became very famous very quickly, he suddenly had this huge pulpit to kind of speak from, and people listened to what he had to say. This is where we start to see a division between the science part of the permanent agriculture movement, the religious piece of the biodynamics, and then the cultish pseudoscience of the organics movement, all split in different ways. Even if the science wasn't perfect in the 40s and 30s, the difference became that the permanent agriculture movement was focused on what the newest science said, while the organics and biodynamics kind of spoke in broad strokes of how nature operated and kind of relied on naturalist fallacies.
Okay, so the permanent agriculture was a lot more science-driven, and the organics and biodynamics was kind of dealing with this baggage of, a lot of philosophy.
I think pseudoscience is
Yeah.
the word. It's science versus pseudoscience. That's pretty much what it is.
Yeah, with the dressings of religion to justify it.
Yeah, and thank God there was some division in there, because if there wasn't, this would be a cult today. I'm sure of it.
Yeah. Give it time. There's still time.
A real one.
Yeah, and we talked about the Odums, and the reason why I talked about them before the organics and biodynamics in this episode is because now you can start to see why they didn't want their work attached to the organic movement, even though on paper they believed in a lot of the same things. This is a common theme that we see in a lot of researchers that say our industrial food system isn't sustainable, but don't loop me in with those other people, even though they agree with me on this.
It's like that meme. It's are you guys friends? Yes. No.
Yeah, basically. Faulkner himself was a county agent who advocated for permanent agriculture and eventually ended up in Ohio. He took a job just being like a farmer consultant and basically dedicated all of his time to growing food with the soil and how to make it more effective. And his solution was that the moldboard plow was the reason for topsoil destruction. He argues that like there's loss of water absorption and the limitation of plant growth after a season of plowing, and instead he began implementing a system that he called trash farming.
I mean, you got to hand it to him with the name he came up with on the spot. He was like, this isn't soil, this is trash, and I'm going to farm in it. Like, where did that come from? What is he talking about, trash farming?
So trash farming is basically like mulching, and he's specifically talking about the plant residues. So like if you grow corn, how do you get the rest of the corn plant back into the soil to return those nutrients into the earth? And how do you do that so that it's most effective? Obviously, tillage and like the idea of conservation has been done and understood for a long time, but his work brought some of it back to light that had been kind of either not applied or forgotten, or probably a bit of both. Now, at this time, organic farming had still used like spading and rototilling and compost and mulches. Whereas like what he was saying is like instead just put the green manure on the soil and stir it in with like a disc plow instead of burying the material underneath the surface. He claimed that the trash farming system would actually increase productivity by 5 times of like a petrochemical fertilizer, which obviously is a dubious claim at best, and one that we know today isn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I have no love for petrochemical fertilizers, but if this trash farming really did produce like 5 times more food, like why would we ever switch? Or in other words, like why would we switch to a program that produces 20% the food?
For more money.
Right.
Of course.
And it just sounds complete. The advantage of doing it this way sounds completely made up when you just throw out a number like 5 times more productive. And it just kind of points out that kind of pseudoscience approach to things like this, it just preys on, desperate people who are falling on hard times or who just don't know what to do in certain instances. So they look for, easy solutions that are too good to be true. And that's what this sounds like.
Yeah, and we're getting to that part.
Oh, good. We can't leave out the actual grassroots of these movements. See, Andy, I can make terrible farming jokes too.
So proud of you.
Awful.
We're talking about the people.
The PEA pull?
Nope.
No, just go. Just continue on.
Sorry. All right. So as we just kind of pointed out, like the relationship to these movements and the scientific method is really what starts to divide them. This was also accelerated by like wide-scale acceptance from researchers, politicians, USDA officials around the goals of permanent agriculture, which to them was simply a focus on healthier soils. In this process, however, the permanent agriculture movement, or the term, became less about permanent crops and more about branding from whether it was John Deere equipment or soil health or like toothless language to describe permanent agriculture as one that indefinitely satisfies all of our needs for food, fiber, and shelter, which, can mean whatever.
Jesus Christ, it's like they let an MBA rewrite J. Russell Smith's book.
The term permanent agriculture had basically become meaningless, and as it became greenwashed and unsalvageable by the 1950s, there was a clear need for some new language to help like advocate for this position of the science. And as we pointed in the Odum episode, they kind of tried to take it and apply it to the agroecology movement, right? For better or worse. That was their vision. Like these other ideas, organics and biodynamics, we don't want to be involved with them. This has a lot of promise. And they arguably did more damage than help, but they understood that perspective. Now, because of the lack of that scientific side of this alternative agriculture movement, organics and biodynamics continued to grow in the post-World War II era, and it also allowed them to go kind of unchecked, right? Folks like J.I. Rodale, who advocated for increasingly unrealistic benefits of organics, also pushed for like wildly unscientific machines, including a chair he kept in his home that, in his words and quote, gives off shortwave radio waves and boosts his body's supply of electricity.
And wait, what were the unscientific machines?
I can't say those on the radio.
Was he trying to like ground himself? What the hell was he trying to do?
Yeah.
I feel like I could have
Execute himself?
I don't know. I feel like you could have given him a butter knife and introduced him to an AC outlet. Would have saved him a bunch of money and time. Or I don't know. How do you think you would have responded to a potato clock?
No one ever asked him. We could have changed the course of organics if we just introduced him to organic potato clocks.
Things could have been different.
Now, his logic was that he believed that, and this is in his own words, people don't get enough electricity from the atmosphere or Earth anymore because of steel girders overhead and insulation underfoot. Okay.
He's got to be talking about grounding. I don't know.
Yeah, probably. Either way, insane. He was reported to be taking like 70 vitamins a day or something like that. He had all sorts of weird shit like this. He was just a very strange, occultist type person.
Sweet. Modern day witch doctor.
Yeah. And I think this points to like how the hard sciences that define the permanent agriculture really allowed for this to kind of go unchecked because there wasn't that alternative.
No, babe, I love it when you electrocute yourself. It's the ones that don't do it that scare me.
Yeah, basically. Now, what might stand out at this point is that many of the advocates outside of Rodale, who was effectively a businessman who made health foods his business, we haven't mentioned any Americans, right? Even Rachel Carson, who's considered to be like one of the key figures in the explosion of the organic movement, very explicitly chose to not be identified as part of the organic movement. This overlap of people who share like these interests in what the organics today advocates for, refusing to be recognized as a figure in the movement, speaks to like this really tenuous relationship between science and organics and permanent agriculture.
I mean, it's not a good look when no one with credentials wants to join your club.
Yeah, this isn't some fancy society or club for folks with 2 initials and titles and credentials. This is for crust punks, trash farmers, and dirt bankers.
And weed smokers.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, that's me.
Speaking of clubs, we're going to beat you over the head about this really cool club called the Poor Proles Almanac Patreon that all the cool kids are doing. So go listen to that.
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into the Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show.
Rodale was the most pivotal figure for the movement within the United States. Rodale's early life was filled with health-related issues from growing up in the polluted city of Pittsburgh, and the work of Faulkner and Howard inspired him to learn more about the association between health and environment. Born Jerome Irving Cohen in 1898, he was the child of Eastern European immigrants, and he was most interested in becoming a writer, despite his parents' attempts to see him become a rabbi. Judaism remained an important part of his life, and he donated heavily to Israel. In the 1930s, he heard Robert McCarrison lecture in Pittsburgh on faulty foods, which stuck with Rodale, who'd spent most of his life sick. He found himself working as a publisher, and he produced a magazine called Health Digest, among a number of other journals. And in one of these health magazines, he stumbled across more of Sir Albert Howard's work and became obsessed, eventually writing to Howard and eventually becoming close friends.
We're just going to gloss over Israel, huh?
I mean, that is so many more episodes to add to the list if we're all going to talk about it.
I mean, I think it does speak to like the weird dynamics that are at play right now with like anti-Semitism and fascism, right? And genocide.
Yeah, they're trying to change the definition. It's crazy.
Yeah. And like that somebody like, if we think of Israel as a genocidal state, a colonialist state, but then you see like people waving Israeli flags alongside like fascist symbols. It's interesting that there's even like indications of that overlap here many years before, before anyone would even think of that, I think, at least.
Yeah, like I said, the pendulum swings. It's coming back.
Yeah. But anyways, so he decided to move out of the city into a farm in Pennsylvania in 1940, and in 1942 launched the publication of Organic Farming and Gardening. He also formed the Soil and Health Foundation, which he later named the Rodale Institute, and that was to support organic research, which would become the backbone for the development of the organic ideology in the United States. However, he got really bored with actually doing the research side of things, and he didn't really do a whole lot with it because he felt that it was just too slow. He liked having the quick, new answers, right? Clearly, he didn't care about the scientific method. He just wanted the results. By 1949, the magazine had reached 100,000 copies in circulation, and his notoriety continued to grow. In his own words, he described it as, "I am suddenly becoming a prophet here on earth and a prophet with profits."
Damn, a prophet with profits, huh? Talk about a trash farmer.
Is this an televangelist? I can't say it.
Televangelist?
Yes, thank you.
There you go.
I sneezed.
I mean, he was Jewish, so no, but definitely got those vibes.
But I mean, yeah, same vibes.
Yeah. Unlike the biodynamics movement, which had this like huge spiritual issue, right? At least the thing biodynamics did figure out was that capitalism was in many ways responsible for the destruction of rural communities. Rodale didn't feel the same way. He took like the hyper-American perspective on it and focused on self-improvement, individual body purity. He basically leveraged the money in the marketplace that he had created to give birth to like the green, healthy foods industry. So like Whole Foods all came from like his work, basically. Like where that kind of model comes from is because of the work that Rodale did. In 1971, Jerome Rodale passed away, and the torch was picked up by his son Robert, who continued to grow the companies to the point of having $200 million in revenue at the time of his death during an unexpected, well, I guess they're all unexpected, but at the time of his death in a car accident in 1990.
If you're doing it right, the car accident is unexpected.
If you're doing it
Make it look like an accident.
Mm-hmm.
That's a hit.
Yeah.
That was an assassination. I'm saying it now.
Was it Ted Kennedy? Or Ted Kaczynski? Was it Uncle Ted? Can we prove that Uncle Ted was not there in 1990?
I mean, we have the internet and deepfakes now. We can do whatever we want.
True. Let's see that one.
That's peak Ted energy right there. We could look into this. I think we start
crashing a car.
Yeah, I think we start a new cult based on this theory.
Mm-hmm.
Jerome Rodale was no, it wasn't Jerome. It was his son Robert. Robert Rodale was assassinated.
Yeah. I think he was also a Chappaquiddick too.
Just deepfake him in there. Now he's tied to the Kennedys.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over now. You tie the Clintons into that, and we're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
May as well work for Boeing.
Okay, that's enough for our schizophrenic sidetracking.
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't want to be accused of working for Boeing.
Raytheon sound really good right now.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the Rodales had this huge financial success, right? This also made like everyone else around them be like, huh, I could do that too. And that's really where a lot of this pseudoscience really just took off, because everyone could kind of plug into this marketplace that had been created and find their own way to like sell some version of organics, but better. Kind of like you see with like permaculture, right? Like everyone's got like their, like they teach the permaculture class, but then they have their own like secret hack for infinite food, yada, yada, yada bullshit. But this is where a lot of that comes from, at least from the organic side. On top of this, you've also got like the Back to the Land movement, which we started to talk about, but we'll talk about more next week, of like young kids, mostly left, going into the woods or going into like old farm towns and moving onto a farm and trying to grow food organically, right? And as these like young baby boomers went out to live on these communes and like they had these visions of agrarian revival, the default is organic farming, right? That was their whole thing, is like to unplug from society. And for them, organic was more than just like the food itself. It was about like renewable energy, appropriate technology, in many cases for them, like biodynamic, spirituality, all that fun stuff.
Did you just describe hippies?
Yes, the hippies.
Hippies.
Fucking hippies.
It was at this time, too, that the organic movement's demographics, unsurprisingly, changed pretty drastically. It wasn't any longer really primarily fascist, because you have all these young kids that are suddenly into organics, and they're all communists, anarchists, socialists, whatever. They don't really know anything about farming. They're just like, I'm going to go move on to a farm and figure it out. But what you see is like this pairing of like distrust in financial systems and distrust in the government, right? Or at least the American government. So like there is enough overlap for the older leaders of the movement to still have an interest in bringing in the younger boomer folks that decided that they wanted to get into organics, right? So I mentioned Rachel Carson earlier. She wrote this book, Silent Spring, which in 1962 came out, and it basically tore apart the current state of agriculture, saying that it was in a very bad state and that it was going to get worse. And basically a lot of people were just like, we can't keep doing this. It exploded as a book. People loved it. And like that reinforced like this, our food system is poisoning us. We need to get out of here, grow our own food if we want to take care of ourselves, our family, our friends, yada, yada, yada. Between that and like the hippie counterculture, there's a clear change in like how people were relating to the landscape and why they were doing it. It wasn't so much to restore rural heritage as much as it was to be selfish. And I'm trying to not say that in like a mean way, but like be concerned about your own self-health and the health of the people around you, right? Whereas the organics movement in the 30s and 40s was about like healthier foods, healthier communities. The 70s movement didn't necessarily have the communities except for like-minded people, which obviously has its own issues.
So this is where we get the switch from the organics being, you know, rooted in fascism, fascist ideologies, like you were saying. And I guess it's swung to a more liberal stance here with the counterculture movement and the whole ideology switching to, what's the word I'm looking for?
Progressive?
Yes, that's the word. Progressive.
Okay.
That was exactly the word.
Look at that.
You're a
Yes,
genius.
I know. Tell me that again.
No, you only get one.
I tried to be really precise about how I described the boomers in their relationship to organics because while they had very progressive politics, their intention wasn't necessarily in alignment with that, right? Like they're going into communities where they've never lived and marking their space and claiming that space and trying to build an image of what they felt society should look like. But it was always predicated on like living with people with like-minded opinions and so on and so forth. And as we know, those communes for the most part all failed. And also we know that boomers for the most part are pretty Republican and right-wing now. So like, was their politics really what they spoke of, or was that a reflection of just being young and against your parents? And I think that's really important to think about because as we're going to see with the post-Korean War and how that affects homesteading in the United States, the racism, the fascism, the white supremacy doesn't go away. It changes. And I feel like this, and I don't want to go into too much detail right now because that's not the point of this episode, but I feel like the fact that the boomers went into this with a certain mindset is part of why it continues to perpetuate today. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. Now, during this time, the movement to develop ethical food systems continued to grow because people were realizing that like something needed to change. And even by the 70s, like despite the fact that people wanted change and like we had the Dust Bowl 50 years earlier, the 70s were considered one of the worst periods for topsoil health. And it's been called the, in quote, Great Plow-Up. And then like the late 1970s, the energy crisis hit. Now on the farm, the true costs of petrochemical fertilizers became more apparent than before. If the industry had been drunk on cheap growth before, now they had to find a way to continue to consume as much fertilizer as they did while producing way more food. So that's what they did. They tried to grow as much food as they could. They tore out the hedgerows that they planted after the Dust Bowl, And they basically got rid of all of the safeguards that previous generations had put in because they wanted short-term gains.
Man, it's really like we cannot learn things multi-generationally.
I mean, I think it's because people just don't write stuff down anymore. Like if something was written or chiseled into like a stone tablet and it was handed down to your family, don't you think you would like that's probably pretty important?
True.
Maybe there's just too much stuff being written. If we had to chisel everything in stone, we would only really you wouldn't be chiseling fucking tweets.
Yeah, only the important stuff. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like that's how you pass it down. It's got to be like epic. Maybe put like a ceremony in there so it feels important. And every year sacrifice somebody. One of the family members you don't like, so people don't get too complacent.
I know. I don't know if I want to read my like row spacing information like Ten Commandments style. I feel like I don't know.
Then it's obviously not important to you, Matt. Don't know what to tell you, bud.
Obviously.
So farmers had to grow more food than ever, and they did. By the 80s, they increased grain production by 20%.
Ooh.
Unfortunately, the global market contracted, so prices shot down, and they were stretched out, and interest rates skyrocketed. So, what happens when you produce more than ever and demand drops?
Very bad things.
Correct.
The bottom falls out.
The bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So the 70s into the 80s is considered to be the worst economic crisis in rural America since the Great Depression. Probably pretty close to as bad if it weren't for the supports from the government. Like I said, interest rates during this time increased. For context, they increased by twice as much as interest rates have increased since Biden's been president. Farmland's value fell 63% in 5 years, and most farms went from like average income of like $17,000 in Iowa in 1981 to negative 1,900 in 1983. And we saw a few episodes, I think last season actually, how like farmers that were desperate ended up getting suckered into the Jerusalem artichoke industry. And like within this context, it makes a lot of sense.
Jesus, so
It does.
So the average farmer's losing money in 1983. That's awful.
It's not a great look.
Yeah.
No.
Meanwhile, great businessmen are barging into banks with maps, circling large swaths of land, saying, "I need to buy this."
Mhm.
I don't know who owns it, but I'm buying it.
Yeah.
God, please go listen to the Jerusalem artichoke episodes.
That
They're
is
so good.
It's the American dream. Like if that dies, we're doomed.
Yeah. And at the same time, Reagan's administration, their solution to this was to remove any support for alternative agriculture, even research that had been legislated by the Carter administration. There were many notable agriculture economists said at this time we needed to actually worry less about soil health since, in quote, the nation could count on continued gains in crop and livestock productivity. The need to reduce soil erosion would be lessened since minor soil losses would be offset by technology, which is just the most cursed thing you could ever read.
Yes, wires replace dirt.
Never heard of anything like that in anything else. That's just awful.
Yeah,
It's like we can literally not learn things.
we really can't. It's bad. So as the 70s and 80s rolled on, the organic movement really had to address the reality of like, it's this huge thing. They want more power. They want more legitimacy in the eyes of consumers, in the eyes of the government. How do we make the organic brand have value, which means it needs a third party to verify that it is good? And also, how do we try to keep too many people from just using it, right? Except for us. We can do that. No one else can. And this is basically where the Rodale Institute and a lot of other big organics producers, they decided that they wanted to go create organic certification. So like when you buy products today, it has an organic certified blah, blah, blah. The government backs that, right? There's research or testing or...
I think they just pay for the sticker.
Yeah, they just pay for the sticker. There's no actual background to it.
Is it the FDA
I don't know.
or is it the USDA that does it? I think it's the USDA.
It is. USDA certified organic.
See, I know some stuff. I contribute. I'm helping, damn it.
You're doing so good, Elliot. So this division about whether or not to like go public, go big, whatever you want to call it. Basically, this is where the split in the organics movement that still exists today about what the right path for organics was about. Like, we don't want to make organics get greenwashed, but also we want legitimacy to the movement, and we want more people to be able to buy into it, because their whole thing is like they want to take over the marketplace, right? Like they want to make organic everything. That's kind of where organics is today. And I think we see that today with like regenerative farming and all these other new terms, grass fed, cage free. It's like, how much do these terms actually mean? And like, what was the point of getting that branding if it was just going to eventually get watered down anyway? And that's why some brands or some companies will get one certification and not the other, or they'll just say, we're organic. We are organic in everything but certification, because we don't want to spend the money and time getting the certification. Whether or not that's true is another story, but that's a story that many people have heard from small farmers. So I think it speaks to like the uneasiness in which a movement that sprung out that was very anti-corporate, anti-capital, with the exception of Rodale, anti-capital, anti-government, becoming like innocuous and just kind of a part of our day-to-day decisions, right?
Mm-hmm. The argument for organic for me was solved with a carrot. I had a store-bought carrot, and then I had an organic carrot, and then I had another store-bought carrot. And that third store-bought carrot, it tasted horrible, and the organic carrot tasted really good. And that's what changed my mind about organics. And I started to educate myself on which foods you should probably have organic and which foods, you can try to avoid if you have the luxury to do so. Because when I learned about potatoes and how farmers that grow potatoes have their own plots for the potatoes that they feed their family, and then the ones that go to the store to you, they don't eat, that kind of says something to me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It says maybe eat organic potatoes.
Yeah. It's almost like it's incredibly complex and nuanced.
Yeah.
Who could imagine it?
There's a ton to it. But that's just my 2 cents on the consumer end, because all I do is consume too much.
Big consumer.
You got to get some carrots in the ground. Got to get your potatoes.
Bro, you got a long enough growing season. You can start now.
I got to learn about this red clay, man. It's something.
Raised beds, man.
Yeah?
Yeah, screw digging in the clay. Just raise beds.
Just subsoil that, put down tile.
I would have to make like a terrace in my backyard. It'd have to be terraced. Could I do terrace like that?
Hell yeah. Yeah.
Whole
Maybe I'll
raised
do
bed
that.
castle.
But there's like these giant Georgia pines back there, and nothing grows under pine trees.
Blueberries. You're too far south probably for blueberries.
Huckleberries?
No, huckleberry. Well,
Muscadines, they grow down here.
huckleberries, I think you might be at the bottom end of their
What's
range.
the range?
You might be.
We didn't end this episode. What are we doing next?
Ooh, no.
Yeah. So next week we're going to the Back to the Land movement. We're basically framing up those hippies that we were just talking about,
Nice.
and then we're going to get into the white supremacists. Then we're going to permaculture, tying it all together.
We just keep going back to the white supremacy, don't we?
Running theme here.
It's all
Not us,
tied
but
in.
them.
It's all tied in.
It's not projection, I swear.
Goddamn farmers
Goddamn farmers.
and their pitchforks.
I've always said that.
Fuck farmers.
You heard it here first.
Did you find the range of the huckleberry?
Yeah, it looks like black huckleberries will grow all the way down in pretty much all of the eastern United States and Canada except Louisiana and Florida.
Did we talk about muscadines before? Y'all ever heard of those? Muscadines and
The grapes?
scupinones? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they make a great wine down there.
Yeah, they make wine down here. I could probably grow some of those. Think I could be like a winemaker?
Oh man, they're huge.
What?
Yeah.
The grape things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they're like 2-inch grapes. They're awesome.
I'm super allergic.
Oh no.
Who the fuck is allergic to grapes?
There's something in the skin.
Yeah.
Like I
Can
eat
you
'em.
drink the wine?
I had a friend that
I haven't tried the wine. It's not like super allergic. Like it's not like anaphylactic, but like my lips get like super itchy. They feel like super tingly, like kind of pins and needlesy.
Well, that's no
Mhm.
fun.
It gets very uncomfortable. But the little grape things are really good.
do that with other fruit skins too.
No, just those.
Huh.
I was like, my lips hurt. My aunt was like, oh, you're having an allergic reaction. I was like, does that happen? She's like, some people have allergic reaction like that. She's like, not me though. And she just kept eating them. And I was like, oh, but they're good. And now I
You
know
just
how lactose intolerant people feel when they're like, oh, it makes me feel sick, but I'm just going to eat it anyway. Like, there it is.
Just
There
need
it
to
is.
peel each one.
Like, very carefully.
So, anyways,
Anyway,
we'll see you guys next week. And Elliot, don't poison yourself.